Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about being a new lead. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, when you are starting a new role as a tech lead, what are the first things you would try to figure out and or set up in the team's work and workflow? So usually I do what I call the inventory or code inventory. Basically what that means is that I spend because even as I've said to you a few times before, there is as I like to call a grace period, an onboarding period or something similar when you first start in a role where doesn't matter if you're a junior, this goes for the seniors as well, where you are a little bit more or less forgiven for not knowing things because you are new to the role or the company or something similar to that. And that period varies, of course, from company to company. The constant is almost always that everything is shitty and you have to figure out everything yourself, more or less. In Not saying that that is a hard rule of the universe or anything like that, but I've seen it enough to say that it's close, top five of constants in the universe. And so that period, even if I am a senior, I spend mostly on making sure first and foremost that I know where all the code is, all of it. Doesn't matter if it's like something that is a little bit here, a little bit there. I want to know the full span of all the code that I am in some way responsible for. Then I pull all that code locally so I can run all the systems locally and that I can actually connect to development environments and stuff like that. Once I have everything working locally, I make sure that I know where all the pipelines are. Like I usually do is that I request a small story, something like fixing a small bug or some tiny thing. I mean, it can be as easy as adding a unit test for something. And then I want to understand, based on, of course, whatever configuration of setup we have, how does that code that I just wrote, that pull request I just made, how does that make it into production? Because that way, if I can just do it once, then I have a basic understanding of how the workflow usually functions and what steps are involved, both the technical automated ones that are in like a pipeline, like GitHub Actions or Azure Pipelines or something similar to that, but also the manual steps or the human processes like QA testers, or you have some product owner somewhere who's going to prove something. Everybody does it a little bit differently, so this is a very good way to figure that out. And once I've done that, this is usually happen. These things are, I mean, it's not like a sequential list. These are usually happening in parallel. And then I make sure that I know where all the documentation is, if there is any. And if there is not, I usually, if you can go and watch my other videos on how I usually do these things. Usually, what I do is that there is nothing, or if there is something, it's usually outdated. So I just create the next set of documentation. I just write down all the steps that I take to do all the things that I do, and that's usually good enough. But then finally, I also have a look at all third-party services and similar things that I might need, like access to cloud accounts or to logging systems or metric systems, like what have you. There might be various services that the team in question is using, and I need to access to them, and I know something about them. So once that is done, depending on the situation, it's usually I've gotten it down now, so it doesn't take that long for me to do that anymore. Then the next thing I do is that I try to change something small about the work process. So I like to say that it's a little bit like sitting yourself down in a sandbox with a bunch of kids. And then what I try to do is I try to find a shovel or some piece of like something that they're playing with and that they're not using directly. It's nothing something super important. It's just something whatever, and then I try to move it a little bit, and then I observe the reaction. And for anybody who's ever been in a kindergarten class will know that some kids won't even notice, like they won't care that you moved something, and some kids will throw a fucking fit over that you changed something. And software developers are no different. They are exactly the same as kindergarten kids in this regard. Some teams are very open to having suggestions or changes to their work process. I usually find, and I even say that on a conscious basis to people when I've even, that's a different video. I can tell you how I make sure that I don't get fired when I have to deal with a team that does not want to change. But I usually find that the juniors and mid-levels are usually more open to suggestions about improvements within their own work process. A lot of seniors are as well, but there's also a lot of them who are really resistant because they perceive themselves as already being said, they're taught, they're seniors, why would I need to change anything? And I usually say, well, if you don't have any problems and all your stakeholders are happy, then surely there's absolutely no reason to change anything. But, well, at least the past 4 or 5 years of my career has been basically that, to be asked to go in as a tech lead in teams that have poor performance. And so if you don't have the performance and you're unwilling to change even a small thing about your process, well, then I'm going to have to do something that, well, nobody likes it. Everybody hates it, but it's, as I said, I've gotten it down to a science at this point, I would argue. It's basically becomes a question of, okay, so they're not willing to change a small thing. As I said, like, guys, I've been in teams where they literally went to the manager behind my back and attempted to get me ejected from the team because I suggested that we added I used a slightly, instead of using a sprint board, could we try 1 week of just using a Kanban board? That was the big change, and that was a gigantic problem. Some people are super sensitive, and that's why I say start small, do something small. And so if that becomes a blocker, if I can't do like even the most tiny little thing, then I know that I have a problem with these sorts of individuals, and that's a different video, how you deal with these sorts of people, right? But let's assume that I am able to change something. Then what I usually do is that I make sure that the basics are in place. I try to run these things usually in a very similar fashion to how the military does their training of privates and so forth. So basically my argument is that if I can't make you do the basics well, then there's very little reason for me to try to scale it up to do more and more advanced things. Like, for example, my first objective is almost always to make sure that everybody is writing tests. Because in all the years I've ever worked, I have so far never been to a new project as a tech lead where the coverage was above 50%. Never. Not a single time. In front of it's almost like a joke. But apparently this is something that is best practice, so I try to establish it, and usually that leads to all kinds of other sorts of issues and so forth and so forth. But basically what I do is that I make that mandatory, and then I add a coverage check to the pipelines so that the testing is happening. That's a very small thing. It's a small change that has a big impact on the way the software is written and how much refactoring and Boy Scouting and all these other sorts of things that usually leads to bigger and bigger issues. If you can put that in place, that has, in my experience, the biggest impact. Now, coverage is not the goal here, as I've tell every single team I've ever worked with. The goal is not to have code coverage. The goal is to make sure that you are writing tests so you're not skipping it, so that you understand that that is part of your delivery process, which in turn leads to you writing better software, which in turn means that you have to think about how to write testable software, which in turn leads to you figuring out that now, if you don't have a really nice system, well, some of the code you have is not going to be very testable, now is it? But now that you have to write tests, you're going to have to do some Boy Scouting and a small refactor here and there to make it testable. And from there, most of the other stuff starts falling into place. If this goes well, then, well, that's a whole different story. Then you can scale up to more and more advanced things. But these are usually the methods that I apply from the get-go, if at all possible. So what I want you to take away from this is that when I start as a tech lead in a new team, I usually start by doing the inventory, which is, as I said, just make sure that you know where everything is, because I can promise you, as a tech lead, 99% of the time, the number one thing that people are looking to you for is domain knowledge. and so you usually have two blocks of people who are coming to you for help. You have your software developers who want help on technical subjects, like classic one is junior software developers who don't really know something or they need help with something. You need to be able to help them, so you need to know everything about the code. And then you have stakeholders who, like 99% of the time, their only question is, when is it done? That's the only question they ever have. And for you to be able to answer that readily, you need to know where all the systems are, like all your processes, how long everything takes, roughly the sort of people that you're dealing with, like how fast do they usually produce on average. You have to get a little bit, it's almost like being a football coach. You know what your team, you have to know your team. You have to know how you train and all the different practices you apply within that team. And that gives you a rough idea on how much of a chance you stand on winning a given tournament or match or something like that. Same deal. And so once I've done that, I try to move a shovel or a little bucket or something like that. I try to move a toy for the kids and like see which, because that gives me an idea of how easy is it for me to adjust the course that has been set, because there's usually someone who's been working there before I start on, unless it's a completely fresh team. In that case, it's much easier. Then you can put stuff in place immediately. But usually if there are people who already work there, that's the first thing I do. And depending on their reaction, I take either one path or another. If we assume now that people are open to changing things, the first thing I do is always make sure that people are writing unit tests, the basics, and that there is a coverage check to make sure that they are doing that. And the guiding idea behind the coverage is not to get 100%. And I tell them that it's okay to lower your coverage if it is strictly necessary. The goal is to make sure that you know that you can't ship software without thinking about quality and writing software that can be tested. And if you do drop below the threshold, you should have a way to figure out, did I miss an if statement somewhere? Is there something that was not covered, and so forth and so forth? I want them to start thinking. That's the goal. And when they come with me, come then and start writing a bunch of tests, then I make sure that when you do reviews, then the purpose of the tests are not to just get the coverage, because I will check what cases have you written. Have you written good tests? Yes or no? Because if you have people who are just trying to meet the coverage threshold, they need to be rectified immediately. As I said, the coverage check is just there to get them to write the tests every single time and start them so that they get used to having to do that. And then the other part is make sure that they know how to write good tests and how to write code that is testable and things like that, and so forth and so forth. These basics I try to establish. If that goes well, you can scale into more advanced things. Have a great day.